but fourth, civil society, and then danger coming last, monitoring, which I think is very important. And I'll mention that at the beginning. I think if you introduce yourselves, that's easier. I'll just do a few framing comments. Okay, great. Let's start. Welcome, everyone. You've joined, just to make sure you're in the right room, you've joined the Measuring for Impact, How to Build a Case for Open Government session, and we have the room for 2 very exciting hours. In my sense, there's really two areas, complementary areas, which are important to look at. One of them is impact and learning, and so that we can really learn from our successes, learn from our failures, and constantly encourage open government partnership in the race to the top that it's engaged in to reflect on what it's doing. And we have to beware of some assumptions. So that's one area that I'm looking forward to the panel to be able to engage in, which is really learning and how we can do it better, right? And then the second one, which is complementary but slightly different, which is monitoring, and how we can ensure that we are monitoring our commitments, that we have a baseline, we know where we start, and then we know on a regular basis, year after year, how well we are doing, and to be assessed on that basis. So those are 2 introductory thoughts on my side. We're very lucky to have an extremely distinguished and varied panel, so we'll be looking at the issue from a number of different perspectives. I've slightly changed the order of the presentations, so we'll start with Harlan Yu from Princeton University, who will be presenting us a thematic way of thinking really about open government and the relation between transparency, participation, and accountability. Harlan, over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm Harlan. I'm from Princeton University, Department of Computer Science, and the Center for Information Technology Policy. So with a panel that is focused on how to build the case for open government, I guess the first thing we really need to do is to figure out exactly what open government means. And so I'm going to focus on some conceptual framing issues around open government. And then my co-panelists here, I think, will dig down a little bit deeper in terms of actual specific indicators that they've each been looking at. And so what I want to talk about today here is the subject of a new paper that I've written with my colleague from Yale Law School, David Robinson, called The New Ambiguity of Open Government. And so as we all know, there's been a fundamental shift in thinking, both inside and outside of government, about the interaction between citizens and government. And there's a lot of focus these days on government data and open government data. And so in that context, what David and I explore in our paper really is what this term open government really means, and the conflation of lots of different ideas that now exist under this umbrella term, this bucket that we now call open government. Sometimes we're talking about public accountability and transparency. Sometimes we're talking about greater public participation. And other times we're talking about using technologies to better deliver public services more efficiently and cheaply. And a lot of this is, the means to do this is government open reusable data. And all of these things have come into this umbrella term. And so what we argue in our paper is that there's a new ambiguity about what open government means. And there's a blurring of a lot of these political goals with the new technologies that open data can promise. And this has caused a little bit of confusion and often disappointment, I think, with what governments actually promise versus what they actually deliver. And so to start out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical conceptual origins of the term open government. And so the term open government, at least in the United States, was first used in the 1950s, just after World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War. And at that time, government agencies in the United States could pretty much do what they wanted in terms of publishing data. We didn't yet have our Freedom of Information law. And so the press, especially the American Society for Newspaper Editors in the United States, started using this terminology of open government to refer to the citizens' right to know about what the government's doing. And so in 1957, there was a paper published called The Open Government Principle Applying the Citizen's Right to Know by a man named Wallace Parks, who was on the subcommittee in Congress. He was counsel to the subcommittee that eventually passed the United States Freedom of Information Law. And so this term open government through the 70s and 80s and 90s really referred to access to new information that citizens didn't otherwise have access to. And it was really in the vein of public accountability. But then along came the 1990s and the commercial internet. And this is where open government starts to take, high-tech, data-driven twist. And so open government data activists started pushing governments at the advent of the commercial internet to publish its records online. And this really started, I traced this at least back to 1993, when a man named Jim Warren from California convinced the California legislature to start publishing its records online. And this trend eventually spread to a number of other states and eventually to the U.S. Congress when they launched their platform or portal or whatever you want to call it, called Thomas, which published all the draft laws in the U.S. Congress. But at the same time, there was a number of other parallel open movements that you guys might have heard of, open source software for source code, open educational resources, open access to scientific and other creative works. And this prefix open started to be applied to a lot of different nouns and eventually was also applied to open government, but in a different way than the 1950s Freedom of Information open government activists meant what they meant by open government. And so when you use the word open with government, it means two things today, at least two things. Philosophically, it suggests, like open source and open access, participation and reuse, right? No licensing of the data, no restrictions about how citizens should be able to use government data. On the other hand, there's a technologically inspired definition of open, which is the focus on raw, unprocessed government information that's published in a structured way. And so eventually, of course, this prefix open was used for government, and I think we saw the first kind of online open government initiative in 1996 called OpenSecrets.org. This was a website in the United States that published campaign finance disclosures about who was donating to campaigns. So if you could skip ahead, actually. So open government data, skip ahead, two more, sorry about that. So what we have is we have at least two different strains of what you might be able to mean when you say open government data. And it really depends on how you parse the term, right? Are we talking about, on the one hand, data about an open government, right? Where open government here means an accountable government where the citizens have the right to access information? Or are we talking about the more recent uses of open data technologies applied to government data? So if sometimes you could use government here as a noun, where open modifies government and data, but sometimes government can also be an adjective. We're talking about government data that also just happens to be published technologically in a structured, machine-readable format. And so what we argue in our paper is that, in the past several years, this term open government is being used to mean all sorts of different things. Different policy actors and stakeholders in governments mean different things when they say they're promising open government or they want open government. So on Obama's first day in office, he published 2 presidential memoranda about open government. And it really talked about the accountability side, but really what a lot of what we've seen is about open data and data.gov. And so this blurring, I think, has caused a bit of confusion. And so what we try to set out in this paper is to provide a better kind of conceptual framework for thinking about what people mean when they talk about open government. So if you could skip to the next slide. I think it's really the word open that is confusing, because open can be applied both to data and to government. And so I think it's really important to separate the technologies of open data from the politics of open government. And we kind of frame it like this, where on the vertical axis, we're talking about technology. And instead of using the word open, maybe we can use 2 other words. Inert data at the bottom of the southern part of this graph. Inert data is data that is difficult to use. And adaptable data, on the other hand, rather than open data, is data that once the government puts out into the public can be adapted to all sorts of new creative uses that government might not have originally conceived of. On the lateral axis, we're talking about the political goals of open government. And here, admittedly, we simplify a little bit, but there are lots of different goals, right? And on the one hand, you might be talking about a better service delivery. And on the other hand, you might be talking about public accountability. And depending on what your goal is, you might have different reactions from government. How collaborative governments are, or how open they are to the idea. And so, just to get a little bit more detailed, if you go to the next slide, on the lower left, when we're talking about service delivery and inert data, right? There's obviously overlaps of these two axes. We're talking about printed bus schedules. There's not much you can do with printed bus schedules. The purpose of a printed bus schedule is really for service delivery. On the other hand, if we move north on this axis, we're still talking about transit and routing citizens from place to place in their city. But rather than a printed bus map that you can't really develop on, we're talking about GTFS, which is the General Transit Specification Feed, which is a way for cities to publish transit data in a machine parsable way that has launched lots of innovations for service delivery to get people onto public transit. On the other hand, moving to the lower right-hand side of the graph, now we're talking about inert data that's used for a different purpose. And this is an example is campaign finance disclosures, whether they're printed out and in a dusty cabinet or as PDFs that are really difficult to parse with machines. This is inert data that has a different motivation, which is public accountability. And I think a lot of what we want to get to is to move in a northwesterly direction where we have both adaptable data and public accountability. And an example of this would be in the United States, structured releases of White House visitor logs, who visits the White House and is having meetings with the presidential staff. And so I think this framework is something that hopefully can be useful when we think about what governments are promising and what we're asking for. I think open data is an amplifier for a lot of these political goals, right? It's mostly uncontroversial. It's universally celebrated when people put up open data portals. But that's a dangerous thing to do. So one thing that I heard the other day was a government official saying that the symbol of transparency and accountability in this day and age is having an open data portal. And I think that's really dangerous thinking because technology is relatively neutral. There's lots of things you could do with open data. Open data does not equal open, transparent, and accountable government. And so I think the hazard here to watch out for is what I've been calling accountability theater, which is setting up open data, providing open data technologies, and really skirting around the hard-edged political issues around accountability. And so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Harlan. And a special thanks for coining a new term, accountability theatre. Rolf, over to you.
That's my definition of open government. Why would the OECD have something to say on that? And I think, is it okay? Why would we have something to say on it? Because I think we have been spending quite a bit of time on trying to measure what open government means today and what it could mean in the future. And I would say I'd rather, instead of providing too many answers, would raise perhaps 3 questions that sooner or later will have to address. It really is about, you said about impact. Impact on what? And of whom? So I think there is a certain degree of need to clarify what we actually want to impact on and how do we measure it. So there is a real issue about what is it that we want to measure. And for that, we need to clarify impacting on what. We have tried to put together a few data for quite a number of years now about, for example, do governments have access to information policies? But we don't want to know whether they have a law that stipulates it, but what is the practice? How does it actually work? And I think that's where open government is particularly important to analyze thoroughly. Does it produce what it is supposedly offering? So my question here would be, if we know what we want to measure, how do we know that we are improving, getting closer to our objective? And that's not a question of formality, it's a question of practice. Therefore, we should perhaps ask ourselves, what are good practices for following up on the promises of open government? Practices, not just formality and not just a process that is described well. How is it lived? How does it work on an everyday basis? And my third point is what you've referred to, monitoring. You know, once we have said what we want to measure, how do we get there? Then from time to time, I think open government requires that we are making a little stop and say, how does it look like? Where are we now? How far have we come, and how much did we deliver? And if I say did we deliver, I don't mean just the governments. I mean all the stakeholders involved. And if I'm just sort of listening to the various discussions that are going on here, I think there is an enormous variety of ideas of what it is that we would like to monitor. But it's a very useful, a very urgent debate, because I think we're making here, as I said, a commitment. Governments actually have made here commitments, pretty strong commitments when they met last September. They made commitments, and what is at stake here is, among others, their credibility. Have they delivered on what they were saying? And there is not much that you can do about it if you are caught by not being accountable to your commitments. So the process in itself needs a lot of fine-tuning. And I think here, perhaps this panel today can make a contribution to those 3 questions. What do we measure? How do we improve? And what do we monitor? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Rolf. The issue of monitoring the Open Government Partnership, now that we have 55 members, part of the partnership is absolutely key. Monitoring within the OGP through the independent reporting mechanism, monitoring independently through civil society, monitoring through academic institutions, a number of different bodies is key to the, I really believe, to the success of OGP over the next few years. On that note, Nikos, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nikos Passas. I'm from Greece and live in the United States. I've been doing anti-corruption work for many years, starting with the legislative guide for the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, the content and part of the architecture of the checklist and monitoring instrument that's being used to review the implementation, a legal library that you can find on the UN website of national texts that correspond to every paragraph of the UN Convention in every country, And I have seen through this work how we've created a lot of texts, a lot of laws, a lot of institutions, and a lot of processes. But one of these processes brought me to various regions, including Africa, where a prosecutor at the end of the outreach, where we were explaining what does it take to actually effectively implement the UN Convention Against Corruption? How do we turn this instrument into a different way of life? What G said, the prosecutor from Kenya said, what you're asking us to do is actually changing our way of life. It's not just some tinkering, some changing here and there. We're talking about changing the way we do business, the way we do government. So my concern is, with all the instruments, and there are many more that governments have to implement and businesses have to deal with, my concern is, does it change the quality of life? Does it make it a better economic environment and a more competitive environment for economic growth? Are people happier? Are people more satisfied with the government? Is public-private partnership actually working? So the work I've been doing started with a constructive review, constructive criticism of existing mechanisms or methods to measure how governments, how countries are doing their anti-corruption work. And the criticism of what we saw turned into something that we tried in Brazil and we will be implementing in Brazil as well as other countries, including Morocco, Egypt, and others. And it is based on performance indicators and benchmarks. And there I found out along the way that Michael Johnston, who was collaborating with OECD, was doing some work along those lines. And we thought, we're going to build on that. We're going to build on the critique of previous methods, and we'll come up with something that is going to do exactly what. Can we move to the next slide, please? To do those kinds of things, what you see here in the PowerPoint slides is the opposite of what we found is falling a bit short in some of the other instruments. And how we do this is that we are developing performance indicators that look at those aspects of government. It has to be something that is understood, it has to be something that is very concrete, and it has to be something that is scalable. You can use it within your agency, you can use it in your city, you can use it in your community, you can use it in your state, your country, and you can use it for international comparisons. So what the government, the emphasis, by the way, that is important. We're not trying to measure corruption. We're trying to actually do the opposite. We're trying to measure integrity and accountability. We're focusing on what governments do, can do, and should be doing better, or could be doing better. And what do governments do? They regulate, they provide services, and they administer things. So those are the kinds of areas we want to concentrate on, and we want to create standards and benchmarks with respect to the quality, speed, accuracy, responsiveness, and cost of government operations with respect to these activities. And as we do that, we want to focus on the positive, reward anti-corruption leaders, but also identify priorities and vulnerabilities. And therefore, that's where you see and I will give you examples of the concrete measures that we're developing in a moment. So those will have to have a number of features, and that's what I will be able to explain. We can discuss more details later. They're not going to be a monolith, one grade or one characterization for the entire country, but we're going to look at different sectors, economic sectors, different regions, different cities, and different agencies. It's very possible that something is done very well, let's say on procurement at the federal level, but in a city or municipal police, you may find problems. So if you just write a report only about a country, you miss those important contexts and variations and specific issues. So we did outreach. We spoke with all stakeholders from various parts of the economy, private sector, civil society, academics from 4 different universities, and many. CGU was the leader here and the coordinator, but there were other government organizations that participated and contributed very successfully. Important feature of this tool is that it tells you where the country is going. It is predictive, and it is not a mirror of the past. It is not based on perceptions, but on very concrete, objective, measurable, understandable data, such as I apply for a license, how long does it take for me to get it? I apply for information, when do I get it? Do I get all of it? Things like this that everybody can understand and everybody can analyze independently as well. If we can switch, please. Importantly, they come with ideas for change. They come with policy suggestions. So if we have an issue here, what can we do to improve the situation going forward? We want to have quality data, as reliable and as valid as possible. And we want all this, once it is done, to become fully available to the public, to the media, to everyone, available online, for everyone to do their own analysis to complement ours. If we can go further, please. The emphasis on positive values. Whenever we see an anti-corruption leader, whenever we see progress that is made, we need to support them. We have seen in too many countries people who are working, who are fighting a lonely battle, who are facing a tsunami around them. They need help. This is an instrument that is designed to support them and build momentum. For many countries, we find that anti-corruption, integrity, and accountability objectives are not overnight tasks. They're going to take 1, 2, many more generations perhaps. But we recognize that you have to make some small steps. You will have to accomplish some small victories. You will have to gain momentum. And those small victories on the basis of a strategy that you have are instrumental, conducive to the attainment of the longer-term goals that you have. So everything comes together, and you gain legitimacy and credibility with that. Importantly, you will be able to have trend lines. Are things going up? Are going down? Are things going better, or someone is dropping the ball? And that is important for internal purposes. Some agencies may want to do that for their own progress, but you can do that comparatively within the country or across countries. Here is one example, and we can actually go to the next one where I can give you some more things. An indicator of the quantity, price, and quality of goods received. You can narrow it down to something very small, like how much do government agencies pay for small things like water, gas, ambulances, medical equipment, computers, and things like this. Is the price the same everywhere, or is it vary? Each of the indicators that we'll come up with comes with a benchmark and ideas on where can you get your target. And that can be set by the agency itself or after some brainstorming. It has a linkage to the corruption. If you have prices, if exactly the same, let's say, photocopying paper, I pay $3 per unit in one city, but another city in the same country is paying $25, that indicates that something may be wrong. It's not necessarily proof, but it will give you something to work on and go and find out why that discrepancy, right? It tells you where you have the discrepancies, where you have the problems, where to look, and actions indicated, go and talk to them, find out. I know that in many instances procurement is a tough issue to monitor because you do not have all the details in a readable, computer-readable form. Sometimes you have things in a PDF file, but that's a scan, so you cannot search it. So those are the kinds of things that you cannot automate so easily, but some you can. And others, you can actually take a sample and go and read the documents that you have. Increasingly, what we would encourage is, when it comes to procurement, get as much computerized information as possible, because that simplifies the task of monitoring. But when you see those discrepancies of paper prices or water prices across the country, you monitor that over time, and after you came into contact with them, and you see, did something happen? Did the prices go down? did they do something about it, right? And if they do, you give them their reward. If they don't, then you know that you have something that you need to act on, right? And with these trend lines and discrepancies or convergences, over time you can find out whether the incentives and opportunities for corruption and fraud are being squeezed out of the system. That is the point. So it doesn't give you a measure of corruption, but it gives you a measure of, is the government actually doing its job properly, right? And are people happy with that? The comparability issue, and that's the second to last slide, I'll be very brief. We find that there are extreme particularities, extreme differences from country to country. So some indicators will be developed just for the local needs, which is fine. But those indicators that can, so you can use those for comparisons, temporal comparisons. Are we doing well? Are we making progress? Where do we need to focus, and so on? But those that are across the board, and there you can take things like open government principles, the UN Convention Against Corruption, the OECD, the OAS, the African Union, all kinds of standards that we have that we need monitoring, and they produce data, and they produce actions, and there is a lot of information to input for this sort of purpose. You can use all this for cross-country comparisons, and you can see which countries are providing good practices, adaptable to other contexts, and work with those. Thank you so much, and I will be answering any questions you have in a minute.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for providing such clear and specific examples of what we're talking about. I think it'll be hugely important and useful for the countries as we're monitoring the different commitments. Next up, Juan Pablo Guerrero for a civil society perspective from Mexico. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon. I am a member of the International Budget Partnership, but I'm going to share with you an experience, a very concrete experience of assessing the impact of disseminating the right to information in poor communities in Mexico. This is an experience that I think links the importance of assessing a policy, a specific policy, for better decision making in public bodies. I apologize in advance because I know some of you know this experience, which is not a very new experience. But I think that it stresses quite clearly the importance of independent external evaluation on the use of public resources. I won't go into detail in explaining how the access to information law works in Mexico. Basically, it is a law that allows anyone, anytime, to submit, apply for government information at the federal level. Government is obliged to respond. The system works in such a way that basically requesters can apply for information from an anonymous stand, and there is the existence of a body, the Federal Institute for Access to Information, the Information Commission, in charge of enforcing and oversight of the whole system. It also has the power of solving at the end if the information requested is or not public, if the requesters complain before it. So the impact of this is that there is a system that the public trusts, and therefore let's go to see, yeah, there it is a system that the public uses. So far, there has been more than 700,000 requests, But what I would like to stress here is that this demand for government information is very concentrated. This can take us to a very interesting debate. Is this a problem or not? Basically, that's the way it is, and I think that this is anyway important. The fact of, for instance, having journalists using this and then publishing the findings of the request has a significant impact in the society. However, a question remains how to make sure that poor people use the right to information. So the Information Commission launched a specific project that was accompanied by an independent impact evaluation conducted by the main university in Mexico City, some researchers from the political science department. The objective was to find the best ways to have marginalized, out of the center common citizens to use the right to know. The project was operated in 9 states and more than 100 communities. The profile of the participants were mainly indigenous, 60% women, and many of them live beyond the line of poverty as defined in Mexico. The way to make possible for poor people to use the right to information forced to get allies at the local level. It was very difficult for the government to go directly dressing in a suit and wearing ties and convincing poor people that this was right for them. So it was important to find at the grassroots level legitimate intermediaries. The key factors to make possible the right to information awareness in those communities were the strategic involvement of civil society organizations, the partnership with community leaders placed in these organizations that had good recognition at the local level, and clear advocacy strategies directed at those specific groups, linked not only to the right for information, but mainly to other basic rights or community needs where the right to information could be an instrumental right for them. It was important to have a very significant involvement in government in this effort of the Commission, in training, following up, and making sure that, among other things, these civil society organizations could use internet to make their applications for information. I'm going to leave the presentation for your kind consideration. You can see some examples of success. Let me, in the last 2 minutes, focus on the independent evaluation. The goal of the evaluation was to assess the impact of this project, to find out how the right to information has been used in poor communities. It was applied by surveys and interviews in the concerned communities. Group control was used for assessing impacts. There is a book that was published last year with the results, and you can have the link of the book in the presentation. The main results prove that the poor communities, poor people, use the right to know, to stop abuse from authorities, to defend other basic rights, to engage in their local development, and to secure access to public services. Out of the surveys, it can be reported that most of people acknowledge that using the right to know helped them in resolving their problems. Half of them said they were capable of submitting requests in the future, and most of them thought that the right to information was useful. The study also clearly identifies some obstacles for the use of the right to information in those communities. Among them, the fact that the information is provided in a very complex, fragmented way, it needs time and patience to get the information, things that you are all aware of, and that are clear obstacles for the communities. Now, also benefits for governments were identified. Among others, the understanding of the social needs increased. There were also increased chances for innovation in service provision, and better conditions for community engagement in their own developments. Among other benefits for the organizations that were involved in the experience is that they had ownership of the right to information in other strategies to support their communities. Finally, some lessons. It is clear that government information is difficult to use for civil society in general, but it is strategic for building up citizenship. However, it requires meaning and usefulness. It gets meaning and usefulness when it becomes a practical tool for preserving basic rights. Now, if the goal is to disseminate the right to information in poor communities, you absolutely need local intermediaries and continuous mentorship for this effort. Big national campaigns are not useful. Under those conditions, the technological gap is surmountable. However, the effort also needs sustained leadership from the institutions involved. In the particular case, the effort was abandoned in 2008 after the Information Commission gave way to other priorities. What is important of this lesson, I believe, is that many questions that were put on the table on how to address a specific problem, dissemination of the right to information in poor communities, were able to be tackled thanks to this project and the external evaluation that gave all the answers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I think for all of you in the audience, especially from government who are preparing and implementing commitments, it also highlights the importance of impact evaluations, possibly running alongside some of your programs. And I think one of the innovative findings in Mexico is this combination of implementing a program and at the same time having a research project running alongside the program and monitoring it continuously, which is something we might want to talk about. Jorge Garcia Gonzalez from the OAS. Up to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jorge Garcia Gonzalez. I am the director of the Department of Legal Cooperation at the OAS. For all of you that are not familiar with the OAS is an international organization based in Washington, D.C. It's an organization that gathers all the countries of the Americas, from Canada to Argentina, including all the Caribbean countries. And I'm going to talk about the MESI-SIG, and I know that some of you are familiar with the MESI-SIG, but maybe some of you are not familiar with the MESI-SIG. The MESI-SIG is a mechanism that I think is related to the two topics that were mentioned by Martin at the beginning, which are monitoring and learning. I have prepared a presentation. I think that they are going to put that presentation because the MESI-SIG is a mechanism. The MESI-SIG is a mechanism for monitoring the implementation of a anti-corruption convention that was adopted at the OAS, but it's also a cooperation mechanism, and that is something that we always underscore, that it's not only a monitoring mechanism, but it's a cooperation mechanism. What is the framework against which we assess the commitment of the countries? The framework is the convention. The convention, it was the first treaty on this area on anti-corruption. It was adopted by all the countries of the OAS in 1996. It's quite a broad convention. It addresses the preventive measures, the criminalization of acts of corruption, and it also has provision to strengthen international cooperation among states in anti-corruption matters. Right now, we have 33 state parties. there is only one of the active country members of the OAS that is no party to the convention, which is Barbados. All the other countries are party to the convention. After the adoption of the convention, they adopted this monitoring mechanism that we call the MESI-SIG. The MESI-SIG is an intergovernmental mechanism. It's a peer review mechanism, so similar to other peer review mechanisms in which countries assess the implementation of their commitments among themselves with the support of the technical secretariat of the OAS. But a key characteristic of our mechanism is the participation of civil society organizations. They have a broad participation in the mechanism. There is a due process for the evaluation of the implementation of the convention. We assess the implementation of the convention in different rounds. And one tool or one instrument that we are implementing right now in what we call the 4th round of review is the on-site visits. The mechanism, so the countries that are are evaluating or are assessing the third country are visiting the country. They are interviewing the different national authorities, and they are also meeting with the civil societies organization, and they are gathering information directly in the country about the implementation of the specific measures of the convention that are under review. And with all the information, we adopted a specific country report for each of the countries or each of the state parties to the convention. We also adopted what we call a hemispheric report, which is a report on how the region is in the specific areas under review. And we also adopted what we call a progress report, because each year countries need to report how they are in making progress in the implementation of the convention and the recommendation that they have received from the MESI-SIG. This is a chart in which we show the different topics that have been reviewed in the 4 rounds. The topics that are underlined are those topics that we consider are very related to the topics under the OGP initiative, and in which I think that the MESI-SIG can provide a lot of information for those countries that are part of the OGP and also of the MESI-SIG. What we assess in this mechanism? 3 things. The first thing is if a country has a legal framework and other measures related to the specific topic. For example, the Freedom of Information Act. If a country has a Freedom of Information Act, that is the first thing that we assess. The second one is if that is appropriate. And let me say that in this region we have countries that don't have a Freedom of Information Act. But the second thing that we assess is if that law is appropriate. And we have found that there are, in some countries, there are laws that on Freedom of Information Act, but they have a lot of limitations or a lot of gaps or a lot of problems. And the third thing that we assess in the mechanism is the results, objective results. So if a country has a Freedom of Information Act, for example, second, if it has a Freedom of Information Act, if that law is appropriate according to the standard of the convention, and third, if there are results, objective results regarding the implementations of that specific legal framework. The next slide shows some of the results that we have gathered at the regional level. So what are the main recommendations in which we have make recommendations to the countries? This is at the regional level. For example, the issue of access to information and how many countries have received those specific recommendations. The next one shows the topic of a mechanism to encourage participation of civil society in public administration, which is another topic that is also related to the OGP and that was assessed in the first round of review of the MESI-SIG. The next slide shows The other thing that we do at the MECC is not only to assess the implementation of the convention, but also to assess the progress of the countries in the implementation of the recommendations that they have received within the MECC framework. So, for example, in the first round, they received some recommendations related to the topic of freedom, the access to information. In the second round, we started to review how those countries have implemented those recommendations. And this slide shows the replies that we got. So, for example, the number of countries, the number and percentage of measures regarding which no information was provided. In some areas, we didn't receive any information from the countries. In some other areas, countries report some progress, but they haven't implemented completely the specific recommendations. And in other topics, we received information that show that the country have implemented completely the specific recommendation. And this is assessed by the committee of experts in which all the countries, all the state parties participate. The next, and I have 2 more slides and that's it. The next slide shows the different categories of action for the implementation of recommendation. I am not going to go one by one, but you can see on this chart what are the kind of recommendations, the action that has been taken by the countries in order to implement the recommendations. So this is the part monitoring. But if we can go to the next slide, this is not the only thing that we do at the MECC. The other thing that we do is to try to strengthen the cooperation among our state parties. The first thing is by the monitoring, because when you are monitoring the countries, you also learn what the other countries are doing, in which area they have made progress, in which areas they have some gaps, and you also get a lot of information that is useful for your own country. But in addition to that, we have developed different tools of cooperation. The first one is the plans of action. We have supported 70 countries of this region to develop specific plans of actions in order to implement the convention and the recommendation that they have received from the MECC. Those are very specific plan of action in which we take recommendation by recommendations, because it's something that is done at the country level with the support of the national authorities and with the support of national consultants. They take recommendation by recommendation what the kind of action should be taken in order to implement that recommendation, who should implement that recommendation, in which time frame that recommendation should be implemented. And that is done in relation to all the recommendations that each country received. That is one of the tools. The other is the portal. It's a portal that you can consult, and probably some of you are familiar with that. It's a portal on the OAS website that we call the Anti-Corruption Portal of the Americas, which gathers information about all the actions taken by the countries in this area and also all the development within the OAS framework. In that portal, you can also get information about the different developments on legislation in the areas related to our convention. We have also developed legislative guidelines for each of the topics that have been assessed within the MECC framework. We have developed model laws, model law on access to information that probably some of you are familiar with it, but also on protection of whistleblowers. And we have an anti-corruption bulletin that is distributed by email, and periodically we organize anti-corruption conferences at the regional level, which the main purpose of those conferences is to exchange best experiences. The last one was organized in Cali, Colombia, and that was last year, and the previous year we organized a similar conference in Peru, in Lima, Peru. That is what I wanted to share with you about our work in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We look forward to your views and comments. Just a quick couple of points from me before kicking off. I think one of the exciting challenges about measuring and assessing the impact of OGP is that on one hand, the 55 countries are engaged in a process where there are a certain amount of guidelines for the process, so we can assess the degree to which countries are following those guidelines and how, but mainly the commitments are unique to the countries. And the commitments, as you know better than I do, could be about a range of different issues. So some of you are working on environmental disclosure, some of you are working on access to information writ large, others are working on open data, more are working on extractives, transparency. And I think we have a really exciting challenge, which is to find what the right type of impact measurement is that will work in each one of your countries and be able to do justice to the span of different issues that the Open Government Partnership looks at, but at the same time really pushes us to continue and move further in the race to the top that we're engaged in. And the last quick point is that I think we'd also love your views on who does the monitoring. Not quite who monitors the monitors, but who does the monitoring? Are these experts that are monitoring, and how can we ensure that the voices of the people for whom Open Government Partnership really matters are heard within the impact assessments that we're running? And then a quick and hopefully helpful technical point, which is that I think it's important to see the framework for the impact assessment and monitoring of Open Government Partnership as a tripartite arrangement almost. There's the self-assessment of the governments, and I think for many of you, hopefully this session is useful for thinking through the self-assessment process. There's the independent reporting mechanism, which is independent, but which at least in the early stages is organized and set up by the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership. And then last but not least, we hope that there will be very many independent monitoring exercises led by civil society the world over of OGP, both at the country level, regionally, and internationally. So it's quite exciting to think about how all of these will develop and will fit together in the coming years. The floor is yours for questions and comments. Please, Carol at the back. We'll take a few questions in a group, if there are enough.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to all the panelists. I think this is a very interesting panel, and I'm glad I came. My name is Carol Excel, and I work for the Access Initiative at WRI. I have a couple of comments and then some questions. I liked, Harlan, I liked your presentation a lot. I think it really clears up some big issues, and I hope it'll be used by persons to try and find that sweet spot, which I think was the last box that you mentioned. But I'm a little bit worried about the number of commitments that I think are going to be very difficult to monitor. For example, you talked about the portals. How do you measure if a portal is working or having any impact? I mean, I'd like your thoughts on that. Is it the number of data sets? Is it people who use it? So your thoughts on that would be nice. And I think some of the commitments themselves, when you look at them, as you said, I think as some of the panelists said, you need to kind of benchmark some of what is happening now and to be able to see if there was improvement later on. There's some very general commitments that talk about increasing public participation. What does that mean? Does that mean, there's representation now on committees, there's more public meetings? If you don't have that in the commitment, how then do you create an indicator to measure it? Do you do it now? Do you do it later? Is that negotiated now? I'd like some thoughts. It's a bit worrying for me. Then another thing I think that is really critical, and I'd like some comments on as well, is this issue that was raised about poverty, people in poverty and impact. I think that really is such an important issue that we have to look at. If OGP is to have an impact, we hope that it would have impact to the people who are most vulnerable. We did a publication last year called Seat at the Table, where we looked at how do you measure whether or not people in poverty can use access to information laws, can use these portals, can access budget processes, what are the types of indicators you can look at? And I'm wondering if there isn't a need to look across country to see how many countries have that as a really important critical impact that they want to see happen, and how do you measure it? Because if we do all of this, these lovely commitments, and we don't reach those most vulnerable or even specialized groups, I think maybe we won't have achieved all that we set out to do. So that's also a question. And then the last comment I have is about the OAS experience. I did not know that you did all this monitoring and reporting. I saw a really interesting, I'm from Jamaica originally, I saw an interesting article that Jamaica passed a law 2 years ago on whistleblower protection, and they've never assigned an agency to implement it. What do you do? I mean, what is going to happen if we have these amazing commitments? Governments will do their own self-review. What will happen to a country that fails on some of the big commitments it makes? Will we just say bad government, or is there something else that can happen? Do we give them a second chance, 3 strikes and they're out? I'd really like your comments on that as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. The gentleman just in front of you, yes, yep.
Thank you, and I'm Carol's colleague by country.
Great.
Maurice McNaughton from the Mona School of Business at the University of the West Indies. And I'll refer as well to Harlan's dissertation. I thought it was a very good sort of expose on the, you said ambiguity, I say the schizophrenia that open government data represents. But I think it's a very useful framing. And so then listening to the rest of the conversations about monitoring, they seem overwhelmingly on this side of compliance and monitoring of the transparency, accountability side of that framing. And there's very little on the impact in relation to whether open data actually drives things like innovation and growth and development. And so I don't know if that is a consequence of us still being just very early in the process, but it really did seem to be a little bit one-sided in terms of what the emphasis of the impact and monitoring was on sort of that half of the equation rather than the full sort of spectrum of open data.
Thank you very much. Please, just in front.
Thank you. My name is Fungira Kwena, and I'm from South Africa. I understand that there are 55 countries that have joined OGP, and there will be the monitoring and evaluation process for OGP countries. And they will be having, 3 experts, that are overall. And those experts, when it comes to evaluation of whether the commitments of the OGP are met, they will be the one responsible for getting other experts in different countries. I'm just wondering, because in front of the table, I see that we are having quite a number of intellectuals from universities. It's just sort of a question that, when OGP comes to selecting those experts, it shouldn't be about from which countries are coming from, so that it is perceived as if a certain group of countries, they are monitoring other countries from other regions. That should be considered, because if the experts themselves will be appointing other individual experts in particular countries, of which they don't even know the dynamics and the way in which those countries are operating, that should be considered, because it's understandable that the national experts will be, the steering committee members will be involved. But it's just a question and my worry whether in the particular countries, how is that going to be monitored and in an open manner that will satisfy all the countries.
It's a very good question. I can take that question. And last question before going back to the panel, Toby Mendel.
Thanks. Toby Mendel from the Center for Law and Democracy. A few, 3 comments, really. Firstly, to Jorge, I was interested to see that you had a system for rating the access to information laws, and I guess you chose that as an example. Probably you had those systems for a lot of other things. My organization has developed, as many people know, a tool for rating the quality of access to information laws. I would say we're an NGO, so we're free to do things like that, but it was fairly controversial. There's a lot of debate about whether it was right and things, so I would be interested to know how you did that and how in particular you assess, if a country doesn't have a law, okay, it's easy, but how you assess laws as being substandard, and what kind of criteria you used, and what lessons we might have for the OGP process in terms of setting standards like that. And the second one is to pick up a little bit on a point Carol made. What I have seen already is that quite a lot of the commitments that countries are making in their action plans, and I think it's important to note, I mean, these action plans are country-driven, so they decide what commitments they're going to make. And, you know, a portal, okay, but, I mean, a lot of these commitments are not defined in terms of what they really are. They're a commitment to do something and have a discussion about how it should be done later on and then do it sort of well, I guess, and sometimes there's some nice language around it. But given that these are country-driven commitments, how are we really going to say that they didn't meet that commitment? They'll say, well, that's what we meant when we wrote that. You know, you may think that it should be this portal, but we thought it was this portal. So I think that that's very, very difficult. And then finally, also related to that point, I mean, how are we going to, I know that the OGP is not going to assess the quality of action plans. As I understand it, that's a key part of the system. They're not going to do that. But what if a country's action plan is just no good? What if it doesn't make any new, well, for example, it doesn't really make any new commitments? I mean, we've heard allegations of that here in respect of certain countries. Is the OGP going to say that something that was already pretty much packaged by the end of 2011, and your action plan comes in with that, are we going to accept that? Or are we going to have some standards for that? And if so, how are we going to do that? Thanks.
Great. Great questions. Who would like to start? Volunteers? Yeah, Rob, please.
Thank you very much for those really pertinent comments, I would say. If I may offer just a few experiences out of our daily business in the OECD. What kind of commitments are made? I think there is really an issue of measured against what commitments are against perhaps the national situation, perhaps measured against the capacities to change, measured against perhaps also of what is the list of priorities in the country. So I would say in a process where commitments are made on a very open and very transparent way, at least we would know what governments were ready to do and to join the OGP. So I think there is already a value in the fact that stating clearly what you want to do. Is it clearly in a technical sense? That I leave just really to perhaps Martin to comment on it, what we mean by is it a good plan or not? That's a very different question. The second, I wanted to make this comment here. You raised the question of who is actually monitoring. I think that was the question of yours. Who is the expert? Would it be a self-assessment only? And we know that there are three ways to go about it. Let me just say, from an organization that lives on the nature of peer reviews, that's what the OECD does. People get together. There are no foreign experts. There are no experts from elsewhere. There are simply the people who do the job every day that get together and talk to each other about whether or not a specific policy is working, is not working, or simply has failed, perhaps. And I think there is something that is important, not necessarily to have the input from other expertise. First of all, perhaps to think about whether or not those who are operating those new commitments, that are implementing them, that are trying to live up to their own ideas, that they themselves discuss whether this makes sense and how it could be improved. It's a very informal process, if you like, but very effective because it is a question of practice, what works. Thank you.
Yeah, having worked in the UN context quite extensively, I do not have much hope that countries are going to do things that will satisfy everyone, even at a lowered standard. However, it's important, and I cannot speak for the OGP. I can say, however, that OGP represents a huge difference between what other instruments international standards against corruption do and what is involved here. These other processes are clearly intergovernmental to a large extent, and civil society and non-governmental entities may have their side events, they may express their opinion, but that's it. They do not participate. Here, I think there is a much more, I mean, there's a clear call for the civil society to play an important, active, substantive role. We have to use that. So when a country makes a plan or comes up with a definition we find problematic, well, that's what the civil society is there for. That is what our job is, to say, hey, the emperor is not wearing clothes here. Call him out, right? So, and there are a lot of examples of this, and that is where the contribution from this sort of group will come from. On the experts monitoring, and it is not only the monitoring, I would like to add to that. You will see very shortly on different websites an outline of how anti-corruption work is organized in different countries. And there you will see an extraordinary variety. In some places, the prosecutor is the lead agency. In other countries, it's the National Audit Office. In another, it's an independent commission. In another, not so independent commission, or an ombudsman. Everybody does things differently. But the implementation work and the technical assistance provided is actually much more concentrated, and sometimes you will have some outsiders come in with some preconceived model on what works, and they will impose it on the country without understanding what the tradition, the priorities, the culture, the practices are, and that is a big problem there. So we have to be very critical of the experts in general, and what kind of expertise they're peddling. There is a cottage industry of that sort of thing, and sometimes, in fact, we are sometimes drilling holes in the water, and we're creating projects that are not sustainable. In other instances, we create problems because we put in place institutions, laws, and processes that will take generations to correct once there is a mistake. The one thing that I wanted to emphasize, though, is this, that sometimes the external critique comes out as a criticism of the entire country. Oh, aren't they corrupt in that ex-country? Or in there, you can't do business there. And it is as if the values in the different countries are different. And when you actually drill down, you see that the practices may well be, and you have to change the way that business and government and other things are done, but the values fundamentally are actually the same. You have family solidarity, you want to help your village, you want to have, want to be patriotic. In other words, the difference is how the same, more or less, values are articulated, expressed, and acted out. And when you come up with a strategy to bring into an alignment what the standards and new laws require and what the long-term practices and traditions here do, I think it should better start by identifying those common loci and building on those. Because when people are forced to choose between the legal and the decent thing, that's an unsustainable situation that is not going to take us very far. I can expand on that later, but you probably know what I mean.
Yes, no, I would like to refer to the two questions. The first one was from our Jamaican colleague. I can say these things first. What we have is a peer review mechanism, similar to the mechanisms that they have at the OECD. So it's not a tribunal. We don't have a tribunal. We don't impose sanctions on the countries. It's a peer review mechanism among the countries themselves. But in our case, and probably it's also the case of some of the peer review mechanisms at the OECD, we have a civil society participation. And we have a strong civil society participation in the MESISIC, and this makes a lot of difference because you don't only have the peer review mechanism among the state, but you also have the participation of civil society organizations. The civil society organization can contribute by providing information, providing documents on the issues that are under review. For example, the example of the Freedom of Information Act or the access to information. They are allowed to go to the OAS and participate in the meetings of the countries, and at the beginning of each meeting to give a presentation about the view on the issue. And now we are starting a process of on-site visits. For example, a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had an on-site visit to Brazil. And during the first day, the morning was dedicated to meeting with civil society organizations. Right now, we are doing the on-site visit to Paraguay. And the first day, the morning, was dedicated to meeting with civil society organizations, different civil society organizations from the academia, also representative of the private sector. All of them are allowed to provide information on the topics and the review. And all of that information is considered for the reports that are prepared and considered in relation to the implementation of the convention by each country. And if you read some of those reports, you are going to see that in different parts of the report, there are specific quotations of the information provided by civil society organization, and that information is the base for some of the recommendations that are given to the countries. So I think that that is something that makes a lot of difference. And another thing that I would like to point out is the openness of this mechanism, because everything is published. The information that is provided by the countries is published on our website. The information that is provided by civil society organization is published in our website. The reports, the implementations report that are provided by the countries are on our website. So I think that is a tool also by civil society organization to put some pressures on the governments in order to make progress on the implementations of those recommendations. That is what I can say. For example, in the case of the Whistleblower Protection Act, I am pretty sure, I don't have in front of me the report on Jamaica, but I'm pretty sure that the message said something about that on the report of Jamaica. And that is an issue that is going to be reviewed in another round. So we are going to review what Jamaica has done in regard to the recommendation that were given to Jamaica in regard to that issue. So, and I'm pretty sure that if they haven't done anything, or if they have only adopted a specific act but they haven't implemented it, I am pretty sure that the committee is going to say something in that regard. With regard to the issue of the Freedom of Information Act, the benchmark is in some ways the convention, but at the beginning of each of the rounds, the committee of experts, what we call the committee of experts of the Mississippi, adopted a methodology. It's a methodology in which they established the standards for the review of the specific topics. For example, in the case of the freedom of the access to information, in the methodology for the first round, they adopted a specific standard for the review of the countries in that area. As you said, it's easier to assess if a country doesn't have any law, or in the other way, if they have a law that is very thorough, very detailed, very is very advanced. But in the middle, you have a lot of cases which are quite difficult, and we have had a lot of discussions within the framework of the committee in that regard. But probably we can talk about that later on, because it would be very good to get your views on this issue. And probably I also invite you to take a look to our reports, because in each of the countries you are going to see a different kind of recommendations in this specific topic. Probably that is what I can say right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other views? I'm keen to keep them quite short so we can go back to the room.
So a few brief thoughts on the first two questions. As to Carol's first question about how to measure the impact of open data portals or open data platforms or sites or whatever you want to call them, I think there are some limited value measures that people have been using, right? A lot of people have been measuring the number of data sets that have been published, which is of limited value because defining what a data set is can be a bit tricky. I mean, you can slice and dice a data set however many times you want and say you have 1 million of them, but it doesn't really take a look at what the data actually is and actually how valuable it is, right? It could be data sets about presidential pets, and no one cares, but it's still a data set. And there are other measures about the number of applications that have been built off open data, or the number of downloads of data sets. But I also think those measures are of pretty limited use. I think it's pretty difficult to measure a lot of this stuff because it's not always, first of all, not always easy to see all of the uses. They're not always explicit. So you can imagine a business downloading the data for new innovations, and just because it's not a public website that has users, that's a new service, doesn't mean that those aren't the only valuable uses of open data. And I think the other difficult aspect of open data to measure is that something that we've seen a lot in the United States is an idea that I've sort of been calling absorption, which is the government putting data out to the public. If we're talking about service delivery and transparency, the public putting data out to the public in raw forms. The public, whether it's a nonprofit group or an academic, researchers using that data in really creative ways that government might not have originally expected. And even if these projects aren't necessarily sustainable, or they might just be experimental for demonstration, what we've seen oftentimes is the government absorbing a lot of these new innovations back into government's own processes, right? So I think a good example of this in the U.S. context was with the Federal Register. So the Federal Register in the United States is one of the most important publications of the U.S. government, traditionally printed on paper, but in 2010 was published by the federal government in XML, in a machine-readable format. And what happened was 3 developers from San Francisco, really knowing nothing about what the Federal Register is or was, they just knew it was a really important data set, decided to build a great site that visualized, that made it really easy to search and find things in the Federal Register, which included all of the things that the executive branch does. And eventually, they demonstrated to government what was possible of how people wanted to use the Federal Register. And eventually, they took that same technology and just brought it straight into government, which is a much better way, I think, of getting at what citizens actually want when you're talking about technology. And so I think in terms also of measuring open data, it's really difficult, I think. I think there's people want to try to be very quantitative about things, but I think that's somewhat difficult. I think some of the more useful measures might just be qualitative and anecdotal, as much as that might not seem like a very rigorous way of doing things. I think there's a hazard of being too rigorous, but having the indicators not really mean that much of anything. On the second question, for Maurice's question, I think the heavy focus on this, on this panel on corruption might just be, based on the mix of the panelists here. Certainly there are lots of people studying the impact of participation, I guess just not represented on this panel. But, not being a political scientist, I'm a technologist, but I think, it doesn't strike me as necessary really to invent, brand new measures, right? We've been measuring corruption and all of these things for years before open government. I think the difficult part is being able to kind of control for other factors and really say it was because of open government that these great changes in society actually happened, in controlling for those factors and actually measuring the impact of open government itself rather than other factors that might just coincidentally have happened at the same time is relatively difficult to do. And so I think it's difficult, certainly, too, in the context of the OGP, because there are each country can define their open government action plan so differently. It's difficult to measure comparatively between countries or among countries their progress in open government. I think you really have to look specifically at individual projects, and kind of measuring the process is going to be, I think, what's more valuable here.
Thank you. I think from my side, so I sit on the Open Government Partnership Steering Committee, and specifically, as of yesterday, I sit on the Criterion Standards Subcommittee, which is developing the independent reporting mechanism. I think just reflecting on the panel's comments over the past few minutes, I think, and on Toby Mendel's points, what's unique about the Open Government Partnership is that it truly institutionalizes the relation between government and civil society. And so in that sense, I mean, our peers, you can't hear me, in that sense, our peers, so we don't have a peer review mechanism, but our peers is everyone. Our peers are governments and civil society and private sector. The point of the independent reporting mechanism is that there is, as part of the Open Government Partnership, a way of collecting evidence. Think of it as an evidence collecting system. It's not an assessment system, but it's to collect evidence and to give voice to all sides. So as my colleague from South Africa mentioned earlier, the role of local experts from each country, and we appreciate it'll be difficult to identify them, and we look forward to help in that challenge. Their role will be to give voice to all sides. What we want to avoid is a complete whitewash, essentially, which is an assessment which is blatantly false. What we want is not to assess, but to, as part of the independent reporting mechanism, give a channel to give voice to all sides. And at that point, we hope we will have passed the legitimacy test. The second thing I should mention, which is Open Government Partnership tries as much as possible to be inclusive, and we haven't finalized by any means our reporting mechanism, and very much welcome your views on the disclosure policy of the Open Government Partnership. Experts fed in their views on a voluntary basis, which will make up the disclosure policy of the OGP. So we would love to tap into the knowledge of this room and beyond as we develop our standards. So I hope that was helpful. Are there any other views in the room before we break? Any other? Yes, please.
Are there any existing measurement systems or any existing already used set of indicators that you would recommend to be used rather than creating anything new from scratch?
Any other questions from the room? Yes, Fernando.
Hi, my question is to Harlan, or just a comment on the point. I think it's very interesting to discuss this concept and then try to understand it. I really liked your paper and presentation, and also recent conclusions that fit into some of our recent thinking about that. One of the other there you present some of the dichotomies or challenges on the concept. I think there's maybe an additional one on that you can explore there as well that has been pointed out by the FNORAC recently on the idea on the open data for on the ownership on the government open data let's say is the open government data or open data that is useful for government or governance, because there's something that a third dimension, let's say, of this question, that is how much this thing is inside government, that the data that is useful for it, and how much of this stuff is actually inside companies or inside other dimensions of society that we can use smart disclosure and so on. Maybe it's more from the technological side, but I guess it is another issue that makes it even more confused, I guess, or just something that we need to consider when conceptualizing this term. And I think that this issue of being government data, more and more people kind of try to expand this a bit more to consider also these other aspects. That's not really, when you do crowdsourcing data, is it government data or is it from citizens and so on? So I think that there's this other question that is a quite tricky one when you try to conceptualize the term.
Great. And the last question at the back, Tim?
So I think one other key part around reporting mechanisms is thinking about the learning components of that, the formative evaluation, as well as the sort of judgment. And I know you're saying it's not about judgment as key, but how can that mechanism draw out key learning And connected to that, recognising we don't want governments to fail in any of this, but if we're innovating in governance models, we need to create a space to learn from failure as well as to learn from success. And that becomes a key challenge when we've got a charged atmosphere around around that. But I think those two components might be important to keep in there.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think as we started this session, there's this dual focus, which is we want to monitor the commitments, we want to know where we stand, we want the race to the top, and we also need to learn. And we have to learn for our sake and for the sake of the field as a whole. Back to the panel. Who would like to begin the
Thank you very much. I would like to make perhaps a comment to your intervention and to your question. I respond directly. Yes, there are data. There are data. I mean, it is, as you have seen here, also from the presentations of others, this is not an empty box that we discover now. I think the reality is that countries have been concerned with those questions for quite a while, to different degrees, admittedly. But I think there has been a lot of thought and resources gone into saying what it is that we could measure and how do we do it. And I would just like to be very specific. If you want to see what today exists, and I would claim meeting the standards of international comparability, the OECD has produced data which are called Government at a Glance. It's a publication that came out in 2009 for the first time. And I think in many respects it has been the result of well, I think a pretty thorough process of establishing what is possible, what can you measure, and what can you actually compare internationally. And if you think about this initiative as a forum for a lot of countries from very different walks of life, you would probably value the comparability of data. So I wouldn't want to go into the details of which are there, but yes, it's definitely available. The second point that I'd like to make is really this question of monitoring and learning. No, I really, well, let me put it just in an OECD perspective, okay? I don't think that you ever will have seen a ranking, for example, among our countries, which is sort of the ultimate thing of monitoring, you know. It's number 3, and I'm number 4. So you see, I am. No, I think the ultimate goal of this monitoring is actually improving results. And in that sense, I think I would plead for all kinds of mechanisms that allow people to exchange, to improve their performance and the results of their policies. That's probably where we should really aim for, and not so much about whether or not, you know, the plan originally was so good or so bad. The point is, does it improve in the right direction? And let me say, if you have 55 countries around, and I'm sure that you are aiming for more than 55, if you have them around, Jesus, what kind of richness of experiences will be there available, and it is blossoming. And I believe in not just only the curiosity of people, but also their strong commitment to improve. And if there is a good practice around, I am sure it will be adopted.
Thank you.
I would like to agree with everything well said, and add that, you know, there are plenty of examples of indicators, some of them pretty good. You can take a look at things, and in particular industries. Some of them are very specialized. You can look at water, for example, things like this. The problem, however, is not so much developing indicators, but finding data that these indicators will measure. I could not even suspect the extraordinary diversity of what quality and what kind of information governments collect or do not collect around the world. So you can have the best instrument you can imagine, and you can't do anything with it when you go down to the ground. So it is much more important, that's what we found out, starting with Brazil and some other countries. Do a country assessment, find out what the priorities there, find out where the pockets of good quality data are, start from that. Do this pilot and pave the ground for expansion and then you move from country to country. So a bottom-up approach is actually going to be much more productive, more pragmatic, if you will, than just coming up with good theoretical models and then trying to force them to countries.
So respond to the comment from the gentleman in the back. Yeah, certainly there is a really broad spectrum of the kinds of data that the government already collects and the government and the kinds of data that the government is willing to publish. And there's also obviously the other vertical spectrum of how you actually publish it. Right? So not to beleaguer the point, but you know, under the umbrella of open government data, you can imagine, you know, a country in which the budget has never been published. And the government decides to publish the budget by chiseling the budget onto a stone tablet and putting it in the middle of the city, right? That could be open government data, right? It's new, it's never been there before, right? You could also imagine at the other end of the spectrum, you know, open government data where it's, you know, machine readable, nicely formatted version of a corrupt regime's propaganda, right? Some people might also call that open government or government data because it's open data, but it's data not necessarily about a transparent and accountable regime. So, I mean, I think in terms of the kinds of data that's out there and the way that we think about government's use of digital technologies, it's really important, I think, to, you know, place specific promises and initiatives kind of on this grid. And, you know, it is a simplified grid. It's, you know, some of the pushback we've gotten is, you know, there's not really a spectrum between accountability and service delivery, and that's true. You know, certainly maybe it should just be buckets where you have accountability, service delivery, public participation, using government information to create, you know, jobs and spur the economy. But just separating the two concepts, I think, first of all, will be a big step forward in terms of the ways that we talk about open government data.
Thank you. An additional challenge to finding the useful data regards, to my view, the capacity of civil society to use it and to produce an independent assessment in such a way that it has an impact. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have within this effort of OGP. In the work we do at the International Budget Partnership, we work with civil society partners in many countries, and the investment and the time and the resources needed for building capacity are considerable. And I believe that this is a problem that needs to be addressed within a framework that supposes that the commitments of government are out of the dialogue, out of the consultation with some of those groups. There are, I think, good examples of civil society independent analysis, for instance, for budgets or for public management finances. Juan Pardinas runs in Mexico the Institute for Competitiveness, and they do a great job analyzing at the state level, for instance, among other indicators, access to budget information, transparency in public finances, and competitiveness. But he can tell you how much of resources, time, and talent it is needed to go ahead and be able not only to produce this data, but to present it in such a way that governments are really concerned about it, and that there is some impacts in policy making after these data are produced. Finally, another great challenge is to make sure that the voices or the marginalized poor communities are heard, because even when we find this capacity you find these experts at the national level, it is not always through the tools they use that these voices are really taken into account. So there again, I believe that we should work within conferences or frameworks like this on trying to provide analysis and tools to make sure that those voices, at least for the impacts of service delivery, are heard.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. We have a special request for one last comment from the floor or question. Go ahead.
Many people in the world, and that is, of course, the private sector. The private sector is responsible for many things, financial services, the food we eat, etc. And I think it would be very important that as part of the open government indicators, there are measurements for how governments require the private sector to be more transparent and accountable. For example, measurements such as requirements on transparency around corporate ownership. A requirement that Global Witness has been asking for, which was very prescient in the Libyan uprising, which is for banks to have to be required to declare when they are holding state assets. Surely that is something that citizens are interested in, which banks are holding state assets. So I just think it's important as part of the open government discussion. Of course, there's a strong focus on government itself being open. Granted, we're very supportive of that. But government also has a role in requiring the private sector to be transparent and accountable. This meeting's been incredibly useful. We've discussed mainly transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. Very good. But transparency and accountability in other sectors will also, a lot of civil society, including, of course, Global Witness, will be asking governments to do more in that respect. Thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the opportunity.
That's a great point. Thank you very much. I think we should. If it's very short.
Well, can I just respond real quick to that? I mean, oh, that's okay. Just want to make a comment without getting into detail that in the U.S. the White House has a Smart Disclosures initiative, which is essentially what you're saying, which about getting private industry to disclose their practices in ways that would be better for consumers, either for consumer protection or just for consumers to make better decisions.
Right. I think before I get lynched for standing between people and their coffee, we have one last very short question from the floor, very short, and then last one, and then over.
Corporations and, to fight corruption, I think we've got to consider as well that, they go and do work in other various countries, and you find that if we are dealing with corruption, how are we going to deal with that? Because you find that, let's say it's a country from South Africa, it goes and do business here or comes here in Brazil, and they corrupt the individuals in Brazil. And when justice is taken, we will be saying the Brazilians have to do something with those who was part of corruption. And yet, if it's a company from South Africa, nothing's been said because it's a global company. Thank you.
Great points. Nikos?
I've been studying corporate misconduct for far too long, and particularly financial institutions. So I can tell you that you should not underestimate the power of the civil society. You can have governments require all kind of things, and there are very clever people who are going to find ways to circumvent them. I think that you can be much more effective when you develop. The requirements are okay to have, but you have to be vigilant and do a lot more. And I think that the private, the civil society and NGOs have a very critical role to play in keeping companies honest and to their word. Governments cannot always be trusted, we know that. So why give them an added responsibility to police the police? Let's just concentrate on what we can do. This OGP initiative empowers stakeholders in ways that other frameworks don't. Let's use it for that.
That was a great last point, Nikos. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. I hope you found it useful.